I've titled this study of the sort of Animals in the Dramatic Ecosystem of Prometheus Unbound. And I'd like to give you some background of Shelley and his introduction really to Prometheus and the things that come into Prometheus Unbound. It isn't, just a lyric drama that came from musical lesson and the poem itself. There's actually a lot of other parts to Shelley's life and studies that come into this. So that's what I would like to bring here. In a letter dated 25 February 1818 to Thomas Love Peacock, Percy B. Shelley described a popular site for tourists that he and Mary visited while in Naples. This is what he wrote. The Grotta del Cane, too, we saw, because other people see it, but would not allow the dogs to be exhibited in torture for our curiosity. The poor little animals stood moving their tails in a slow and dismal manner, as if perfectly resigned to their condition, a cur-like emblem of voluntary servitude. The effect of the vapor, which extinguishes a torch, is to cause suffocation at last through a process which makes the lungs feel as if they were torn by sharp points within. So a surgeon told us, who tried the experiment on himself. It is not surprising that the Shelleys would decline to see a dog suffocated for the sake of curiosity. It also is not surprising that Shelley includes the incident in a letter to Peacock, or that he describes details of the animal's behavior as an emblem of voluntary servitude. In Shelley's poems and prose, ordinary animals, such as birds and worms, become mythical in application, and mythical animals, such as rainbow-winged steeds in Prometheus Unbound, become familiar. Shelley's animals, mythical and literal, are significant conceptual keys to his poetry and several of his essays. They populate, so to speak, his imaginary world to embody specific animal characteristics or as symbols of human behavior, including behavior that affects animals in ordinary life. For our purposes here, focusing on the animals in Prometheus Unbound is one way to ground a reading of this lyric drama, as it's called, a drama never meant to be actually enacted. Critics often conclude that Shelley incorporates animals into his poetry primarily as metaphorical concepts, ideas moving with hooves or feathers. David Perkins remarks that in one of Shelley's most famous poems, you may have heard about, To a Skylark, the bird cannot be viewed with fellow feeling, much less with compassion, and that the real object of pity in such poems is the poet, the human being. Read Prometheus Unbound, you will know that undeniably Shelley favors abstractions. Another critic, Anna Orleans, writes, it is perhaps difficult to call Shelley's musings about the natural world empirical, since he is in both prose and poetry relentlessly abstract. We could say then that here tonight an eco-critical reading of Prometheus Unbound attempts to fix, to some degree, that which abstraction expands, so we can feel a little more confident as readers of this drama. Prometheus Unbound gives us a myriad of animals to track: dogs, horses, bees, worms, fish, deer, goats, snakes, kingfishers, moths, and a plethora of undetermined birds and insects are some of the many creatures besides the curse-driven eagle in this drama. I'm going to choose a few of those specific animals in a moment. By the way, there are also two fawns. That's F-A-U-N, if you recall. And those are half human and half goat, if you didn't know. And they interrupt the chorus to muse on the vagaries of perception and the identification of species. One says to the other, have others other lives? So it's a way of incorporating the awareness that there could be species we don't even know about, or how they live. But we can include those in our list as well. But first, readers of Shelley should know that he was a proponent of both animal rights and welfare, although he did not equate animals with human beings. He was a vegetarian from age 20 to his death, a few weeks short of his 30th birthday. With his 2 vegetarian essays, A Vindication of Natural Diet and On the Vegetable System of Diet, they were published in 1813 and 1814, he entered a very active social discourse at that time on vegetarianism. So here Prometheus enters his writing 7 years before Prometheus Unbound was published. In A Vindication of Natural Diet, Shelley interprets the Promethean myth as that knowledge which precipitated the use of fire to culinary purposes, and consequently, as he says, invented an expedient for screening from disgust the horrors of eating animal flesh. In that essay, Prometheus actually represents the human race. And Shelley emphasizes that from this moment, his vitals were devoured by the vulture of disease. So what you eat affects you in the way. And it said it consumed his being in every shape of its loathsome and infinite variety. 2 very important words in Shelley's words, especially in his poetry, shape and loathsome. More on that later. Timothy Morton, he wrote about Shelley's vegetarianism, and he declares Shelley's idea of the body and its conception of food as an interface between society and the natural environment, which makes sense. It's a literal way of enacting the relationship between the environment and us. And his poetry is also a way of highlighting and interpreting that relationship. Shelley believed that eating animal food provoked a moral contagion in 3 specific ways. 1, it contaminated the body by the resultant disease, and the mind by becoming inured to violence. It contaminated the earth by the misuse of its resources for grazing animals instead of for growing crops. And it contaminated domesticated animals by compromising their care in the interest of human convenience, which, as we know, is still a relevant issue today with free-range livestock, etc. He would be right on that page. So a vegetarian diet was to him a moral curative, one that promoted a sympathetic bond with animals and engendered less violent behavior toward animals and humans. In Prometheus Unbound, as another critic points out, the bound Prometheus actually, if you think about it, symbolizes the tyranny of meat eating. Prometheus is like a carcass on which other things feed. He's a prisoner of his thoughts. Speech, remember, into curses. Curses attack. As human meat eaters are culpable in their own thoughts on eating animals and thereby suffer its unhealthy effects. However, while Prometheus' curse on Jupiter has brought the eagle to Prometheus, the raptor is not the predominant animal in this narrative. The more Prometheus complains, actually, the more distant the eagle becomes. The eagle-baffling mountain, if you recall that, is also the nature-baffling mountain, in my opinion, because it exists outside of an ecosystem and only to enact the unholy partnership between Prometheus and the eagle. Actually, in this context, in this scene, the eagle drifts as kind of a vague and referential character, and other things are floating by, shapeless sights, earthquake fiends, genie, during a hailstorm. So in his essays, we have Prometheus connected to meat eating, thereby to cruelty to animals and to the ravages of that on both the human body and the human mind, and on the landscape through farmland. So there's an assumption of victimization of both the eagle and himself in our drama, supported also in the phrasing of the birds, quote, polluting from Jupiter's lips his beak in poison not his own. Indeed, from Prometheus' point of view, the first thing that feeds on him is ice. In Act 1, we're looking at a few lines, and I'll quote those to you. The crawling glaciers pierce me with the spears of their moon-freezing crystals. The bright chains eat with their burning cold into my bones. Do you hear that? It's just extraordinary. Pierce, spears. Do you hear him weaving those freezing crystals, eat bones. The eagle that feeds on Prometheus' heart is not contaminated by this carnivorous act, perhaps because it was assigned the task instead of having chosen it. Rather, it is Prometheus' curse on Jupiter, the speech that became thought and memory, that results in the eagle that feeds on his heart, the symbol of love. The eagle, which is not mentioned again until Acts 3, and then it's just a comparison type of thing, becomes actually a more sympathetic character than Prometheus himself. So one theme of this drama, if we can keep it in mind, is who or what is a victim, who or what is culpable, who is predator, who is prey, and what action, if any, can reverse these conditions. Animals and nature imagery are a direct way into this kind of reading. As a poet myself, to me, these images, I have to say, are some of the most remarkable, not just in this drama, but any I've ever read. Every image, I was thinking the other night, is like an organism with many systems, whether metaphor, myth, natural detail, and Shelley activates as many as the image can carry. I'm going to take, as I said, a few examples of specific animal reference in Prometheus Unbound. Let's start with hounds, by which Shelley means hunting hounds, and they consistently represent human violence in this work. The first allusion is to the eagle as heaven's winged hound, which is a considered insult from Shelley. The Furies, capital F, call on the hounds of hell, and Prometheus remarks that the hellhounds clamor at Mercury's visit. The first Fury recites it as if in an incantation, when she explains that the Furies are ministers, this is a quote, of pain and fear, and disappointment, and mistrust, and hate, and clinging crime. And as lean dogs pursued through wood and lake, some struck and sobbing fawn, we track all things that weep and bleed and live. In the fourth act, the chorus defines the ferocity of time itself before Prometheus' curse is lifted, when, quote, ours were hounds, which chased the day like a bleeding deer. Embedded in these images is the victimization not only of the prey, but also of the predator. Do the lean dogs hunt the fawn because they are trained and exercised into leanness, or because they are hungry? Perhaps both, but neither circumstance is in their control. In Act 2, Asia is drawn into the theme of Demogorgon like, quote, the fawn draws the hound, as the lightning the vapor, indicating this post-Promethean world, this state, where victimization is almost an uncontrollable force. As with the eagle, Shelley implies that the animals are enlisted in predatory ways because of the actions and control of humans. All mention of dogs in Prometheus Unbound are analogies to hunting hounds, and these analogies are used by male and female characters, gods, spirits, everybody. They appear in every act except the third, when the awful shape of Demogorgon sends Jupiter into the dark void where no others can follow. The image of the hunting hound enacting predatory violence of the human mind is consistent, and they were a common enough reference for the early 19th century reader. But in Prometheus Unbound, Shelley emphasizes human culpability in this kind of aggression. To Shelley, then, hunting hounds signify human moral degeneracy and exploitation of animals, and the violence of mind that trains animals to violent ends. In addition, the activity of hunting celebrates the eating of meat, a habit that then encourages yet more violent-minded people. In his essay on the game laws, Shelley published in 1817, so that's 3 years before Prometheus Unbound was published, Shelley complains about the wealthy raising animals of prey on their properties, like a deer park, solely for the purposes of hunting them. The game laws were designed to increase the penalties imposed in the so-called Black Act of 1723, which made poaching a felony. Before, they kind of turned a blind eye. No one but the gamekeeper, after this act, or the estate's landowner could authorize hunting on private property. And the people who crept onto the land at night blackened their faces so as not to be recognized. That's why it's called the Black Act. In the game laws, Shelley condemns, quote, persons of great property who banish, imprison, persecute, and overbear their feebler neighbors. And for what? That they may kill and torture living beings for their sport. He emphasizes the psychological contamination of those involved, citing the fact that the authors of our common law forbid butchers to decide as jurymen on the life of a man because they are familiar, however innocently, with the death of beasts. You could not serve on the jury if you were a butcher. In Shelley's view, hunting promotes cruelty to the hunted, as well as cruelty to those in danger of being charged with a felony, which is a rare occurrence of his writing in defense of poachers. Shelley recalls the landowners described in his game laws essay when the fury in Prometheus Unbound declares to Prometheus, many are strong and rich and would be just, but live among their suffering fellow men, as none felt. They know not what they do. The allusion to Christ's words on the cross is an imperative for forgiveness, and Prometheus, doubtful of his ability to forgive, responds defensively. He says the Fury's words are like a cloud of winged snakes. Because Prometheus gave man speech, and speech created thought, as Asia tells us. Prometheus cannot merely think his way out of his own curse. Instead, he must be susceptible to regret and remorse through language, vulnerable to feeling his own words return viciously on him as if they were alive themselves. That is why words can transmogrify into evils that torment his heart. At this point in the drama, Earth is a kind of like the spirit of feminine influence, this symbol of sympathy, could take umbrage at Prometheus' use of insulting animals, but she's the venerable mother. She's the creative being encouraging intimacy and growth. She's a very good balance then for Prometheus. Earth represents a state of refined alertness, of receptivity. She expects change around her in a world that contains the spontaneous shapes and the world surrounding ether. She's not threatened by such energies. Earth says to Prometheus, I felt thy torture, son, with such mixed joy as pain and virtue give. Her empathy is the antithesis to the strong and rich who live among their suffering men as if none felt. Feeling is a vulnerable state of being and a necessary condition for sympathy. The experience of sympathy is necessary in order for a god to see humans and animals as potential victims of words. Words that create thought from which are formed the icy chains of custom he mentions in Queen Mab. Not unlike William Blake's mind-forged manacles. Ways of doing things without thinking about them. Earth is not vindictive, however, in spite of the destructive repercussions of the Promethean curse in her realm. She directs him to an even deeper sympathy than he is beginning to comprehend. Ascend those subtle and fair spirits, she says, whose homes are the dim caves of human thought. To Earth, human thought is a natural element, and the fair spirits who live there are as organic in that home, she says, as birds who wing the wind. Birds left to their own inclination to fly wherever they like or wing the wind are the antithesis of an eagle forced to enact a violent curse. Shelley's single richest animal referent or image is undoubtedly, any guesses?
Two-headed snake.
It's a snake of any sort, actually.
Good guess.
And there's snake or snakes, the word snake or snakes in every act of Prometheus Unbound. And I believe it's right. That's the amphibians, one with two heads. There are words like a cloud of winged snakes, a snake like doom. That's Act 1, Act 2. Jupiter alludes to an exotic snake. They're introduced as similes, mythological allusions. Jupiter, as you may recall, who was raped Thetis, recalls her words so that he can rejoice in two mighty spirits mingling. Thetis says, all my being like him, whom the Numidian Seps did thaw to a dew with poisonous dissolve. The Seps is a legendary poisonous snake. Another character in the Gods for Sailing dissolves when bitten by this snake. The second poisonous snake in Act 3 represents the desire for good. That's what I mean about the contraries in his images. Panthea relates that the spirit of earth would visit Asia each hour to drink the liquid light out of her eyes, for which it said it thirsted, as one bit by a dipsis. Also from classical legend, the dipsis is the bite that causes an unquenchable thirst. In Jupiter's speech, the snake's insidious poison serves as a metaphor for the dissolution of female power. And in Panthea's speech, the snake bite's effect is compared to the thirst for goodness. It's not a combination. You have to. Then the final reference to the snakes, which is what Alina mentioned, is the amphisbaenic snake, the snake with a head on each end, that Don Ryman said was a statue that Shelley saw in Crown. So myth, any references, he brought them all in. These snakes are not, in Prometheus Unbound, imaged with color, texture. They're not coiled, they're not slithering, they're not like in Paradise Lost. They form into a mist and a cloud and decide, where to go. To use dipsis and seps instead of the word snake in these just particular examples is to separate the animal from its venom, metaphorically and imagistically. At the end of Act 4, destruction is a serpent that would clasp eternity with its length and must be abolished by the spells of gentleness, virtue, wisdom, and endurance. This is the same drama, remember, that says when the ideal world is achieved, the reptile is equal to the god. Another interesting example in Prometheus Unbound is the horse. We know in Act 3 that Act 3 is a turning point in the narrative, but the language around this is not quite as easy to pin down. In the utopian pronouncements of the last scene in Act 3, there are 3 different words for a horse. The spirit of the hour says, my coursers sought their birthplace in the sun, where they henceforth will live exempt from toil in a pasture. Okay, we can get that. He then describes the likeness of those winged steeds regarding a statue in a temple where his moonlight car will stand. This is the spirit of the hour. The spirit then joyfully announces that none became the subject of a tyrant's will toward a fate which spurred him like an outspent horse to death. The statement is marking a positive shift from someone being enslaved to someone being set free. You're no longer subject to the tyrant. But the image is a violent one. A rider spurring an outspent horse to death. Shelley likely saw numerous outspent horses in his lifetime, which certainly must have troubled him. What we do know is when Mary Godwin then, and her stepsister Claire, and Shelley went on their elopement journey through war-ravaged France in 1814, they bought a donkey that they realized later was very weak, underfed, that they'd hired. And at some point on the trail, it collapsed. Shelley picked up the donkey, you can believe this, and carried it to a certain point in their journey where they took it back to the inn and left it there to be cared for and bought a mule instead. A mule would have been a better choice, but he did carry it. Of course, he sprained his ankle, and then, other adventures ensued, but that was what happened on that day, and that's noted in Mary Shelley's journals at the time. As a matter of fact, Keith Thomas informs us that in the 17th century, Illustrations of carts and carriages invariably show drivers carrying enormous whips. And in the 1720s, John Gay described a London street scene. The lashing whip resounds, the horses strain, and blood and anguish bursts the swelling vein. Thomas adds that after unsuccessful bills proposed from 1800 onward, Parliament passed the Act in 1822 against cruelty to horses and cattle. Another critic and historian, David Perkins, offers darker details about the use of the whip and horses. And the whip was used much like we use an accelerator in our cars today. In effect, he writes that when horses began to show the effects of accumulating hard use, they were used at night so that the public would not be shocked by seeing them. Comparatively, in Shelley's another poem that he wrote, The Revolt of Islam, the Tartar steed always remains a steed. The quandary here, then, with these words of references is in our own minds, really. Whether or not to transfer the dignity and grandeur of coursers or steeds to the now outspent horse, no matter how positive the reference. The image outspent horse would have been more immediately accessible for most of Shelley's contemporaries. And to my mind, then, it consequently trumps horses or steeds for reader effect. No matter the spirit's joyful declaration of, quote, thoughts of happy changes and experiences. I'll just kind of conclude a few things to keep in mind as we read. If speech created thought, which is the measure of the universe, as Asia declares in Act 2, then language shapes thought. In Shelley's view, poetry is language made visionary by the imagination. And since it is the imagination that activates the convergence of our sensory data of the world, then poetry propels thought that can bring about great social reform. It must contain, as he says in the defense, at once the center and circumference of knowledge. The poet inspired by love activates the machine of light, that is poetry, in order to change human thought. Remember, you perceive, you think of language, language affects thought, thought creates customs, like eating meat. So he's trying to get into that trajectory there. He's trying to squirm in between there and have his machine of light as poetry change your human thought. Prometheus here then, bringing fire, represents language. The poet does not create life on earth, only the language to direct the perceptions of life on earth to those, remember from the preface, more select classes of poetical readers. That's us. However, in Prometheus Unbound, the language that relates to animals does not always move easily into the realm of the ideal. The idealism such as is supposed to be, the culmination in Act 4. And my point is that Prometheus Unbound is dominated not necessarily by the narrative. If you're reading it and you kind of forget who's saying what and to whom and why and where are they and what's the story, that's okay. Because I think even more at times that what you're supposed to receive in the dominant mode is the elaborate imagery. And have that be the message. That, and the backstory, if you want to call it that, of each image's specific words can be as interesting as what's going on in the drama. And it actually sometimes just goes off in its own direction. If we stay in one place and we fix our attention on this particular focus of the animals and the finite things, then the drama can kind of move through us a little bit better, if you will. And I'll conclude by saying that when Shelley witnessed the cowering dogs awaiting their deaths at the Grotto del Cane, the experience was emblematic of his own fears. That human beings will forever cower to aggression and injustice, and merely await the victimization that befalls them. He feared that human beings were too complacent with social institutions, too reluctant to recognize the tyranny of tradition, however cruel or unjust, however dysfunctional, however destructive to all life, however indulgent to the powerful. Shelley feared putting too much confidence in the ability of humans to perceive the world in a non-solipsistic, self-centered way. He feared he would have no lasting influence on anyone through his writing. He had a very, very small fan base, although he published steadily. He was also concerned that he would become himself so tainted by the social and moral corruption around him that his writings would not only fail to save humanity from its destructive modes, but also fail to save himself from being consumed within them. Bereft of hope and his own confidence in the transformative powers of the imagination, Shelley incorporated animals in Prometheus Unbound and his other works to acknowledge his fears that lasting social change is too difficult to achieve, yet also to maintain his hope that humankind can somehow right itself, can somehow create a world with more inherent respect for life, including non-human life, and the conditions under which all beings live. And he would encourage you to begin now. Thank you.